What I do is the antithesis to advertising. Advertising is the enemy. These awful big things that are plonked down on the streets that are just trying to make people feel inadequate, whereas real community art is kind of the opposition of that. It's like local people saying, we're here, this is our story, it's important to us. Coming from a working class background, the whole gallery scene just felt really elitist and wasn't my people. I thought by creating works in public spaces and on the street, I would be addressing my community. And public art it's not just about me expressing my thing. There's also this element of voicing the local community or the local history or identity of the area where you're working. It's that site-specific thing. It becomes very much about the place that you're making it. So yeah, I started painting murals. Then I got one job where the client asked how long would the mural last, and I had to say, well, I can only guarantee it for 5 years. And then in the course of that meeting, somebody else said, well, we could have a mosaic, that would last longer, wouldn't it? And rather than lose the job, I just said, yeah, we could do that, do a mosaic. I'd kind of studied classics at school, so I kind of had a kind of interest in mosaic in terms of Romans and obviously all that. I really like the fact that suddenly, from being, in a studio with paint, I was suddenly wearing a hard hat and luminous jacket and mixing cement, and that whole side of it really appealed to me. And I've always really loved the installation side of making mosaics as well as the actual physical making it. Just feels like you're really building, Mural painting, I still paint murals occasionally, but you are just sort of putting a surface on the building. Whereas with mosaic, you feel like you're actually building, you're actually contributing to the structure. My work takes me all over the place, but when I go to other places, it's still with that idea that I want to connect with the local community. Because all the work I do is site-specific, the site is my starting point. So looking at the site, but also looking at its history and looking at the community that's there and their history and, maybe the opportunity to tell their stories. Even if it's a community that I don't know anything about in another country, my first step is usually to try and connect and find out what their stories are and give an expression to that. It's not just about me doing my idea, on the street. One of the things I really enjoy doing is telling stories. There's a lot of amazing stories that come out of communities and specific areas that aren't told, they're completely hidden. For instance, I did a project in Brixton a couple of years ago where just talking to local people, I heard this amazing story about this woman who was one of the Windrush generation. She'd come over from Jamaica and she brought with her tangerine seed and she planted it in a pot and looked after it, and everybody told her it wouldn't germinate, but she carried on looking after it and it grew. And then eventually it got too big and she decided to put it out in a garden, and everybody told her it would die after the first year, but she carried on looking after it and it grew. And then everybody said, well, it will never fruit, but she carried on looking after it and it started to fruit. And then the estate was demolished, basically, to make room for, new luxury flats. But the tree survived. The tree was made into a park, and then the new development was around this central park. And the tangerine tree's still there. And for me, that was like this fantastic symbol of the endurance of the local community, despite all the trials of trying to survive as a migrant community in London. And I thought, oh, that's a great sort of story to tell. But then within that, I could interweave the story of local people. So I've got this giant tangerine tree with the roots as kind of people. But then the kind of earth, the background, is all made of photographs that I gathered from the local community, and also historic photographs and drawings and newspaper cuttings and all that kind of thing. Literally a mosaic collage that, by bringing all that together, would sort of represent the spirit of that area. One of the amazing things about mosaics is that people really relate to it. Two really good ways in which that happens. One is that I can go into the community and do workshops with the community and they can all make mosaics. There's something about mosaic making that people find really accessible, unlike maybe drawing, where people have learned that they can't draw, at school, or they say, oh, I can't draw, I'm no good at art. But you give them some coloured tiles and everyone seems to be able to take some tiles, break them, stick them down, make a picture. It's very accessible at any level. I've worked with 4-year-old kids, elderly people, people with learning difficulties, a whole range. If they've got that basic, they can stick a bit down, then they can feel involved. So there's that sort of element where you can pull people in and give them a kind of a connection to the work that you're making. But also, even for people not involved in actually mosaic making workshop, there's something about when you look at mosaics, you immediately see the work that's gone into it. You know that each one of those bits has been cut and stuck one by one by one. And before they even see what you're depicting or understand maybe what the story is, they see that the work that's gone into it, and people appreciate, wow, look, they made that out of little pieces. It's a kind of way in, opens the door up to make mosaics much more accessible than other kinds of artworks in terms of the general public, Making mosaics has given me an amazing opportunity to work in different countries. I did a huge project in Bogota, Colombia. The title was Las Manos de Todos, the Hands of Many. It was all about how the community can come together and improve their own environment. One of the things about creating public arts is, for me, it's about people coming together to improve their own environment and tell their own stories and represent themselves. I see what I do as the antithesis to advertising. Advertising is the enemy. These awful big things that are plonked down on the streets that are just trying to make people feel inadequate, or, whereas real community art is kind of the opposition of that. It's like local people saying, we're here, this is our story, it's important to us. Because it's kind of claiming ownership of the streets, and it's humanising our spaces, which, in this day and age, a lot of public spaces have become dehumanised. I've had a few projects where I have to put the designs into the local authority for planning permission, and there seems to be a lot of resistance to putting artworks on the street. It doesn't seem to go for advertising. I remember having a big discussion. I did a mosaic sculpture on a roundabout, long drawn-out discussions on whether it would distract drivers and maybe cause accidents and stuff like that. To me, it totally didn't, because the roundabout was on a hill, and as you came up to it, you couldn't really see it. So at night, it was quite hidden, whereas once it had this huge sculpture on it, you knew there was something coming up in front of you as you're driving. But then they put these huge advertising hoardings off to the side, facing the road, off to the side, which are designed to distract you. That's the whole point, is there to get your attention. And now you get TV ones now, moving ones that have like massive TV screens. There's no escape. And they're constantly like chipping away at your idea of yourself. Your hair's not good enough, your teeth need straightening, you need to smell better, it's sort of hacking away at who you are, to me, your identity. Most of my projects follow a pretty similar path. I will always start with the place itself. Firstly, actually looking at the physical space, and then going deeper, start looking at what the communities are around there, what the history of that specific place or that area is, and even the geographical ones. I did one project where the reason the client come to me is because the building that they had before got flooded, the river flooded, so they needed a new building. That actually became the focus of the work, the river and the fact that it had flooded. The client wanted something about sports and wellness centre. They wanted the mosaic to be about wellness. So I did this meandering river going through a patchwork of fields with a golden section in the middle that kind of, for me, represented well-being, and then grey sections that represented life out of balance, and then actually the river broke the banks of the frame of the picture. Talk about partly the flooding that happened, but also the life going really out of whack. And that was a really successful project, I think, because it kind of brought together the sort of concept of the building, the geography of the area with the river, but also in the fields I used patterns drawn from indigenous American tribes of the area, and also Amish quilt patterns, because there's a big Amish community there. Felt like it drew everything together and sort of crystallised in this river of life kind of idea. Quite often I'll actually contact local community, whether that's just through talking or design workshops, mosaic workshops, just to get that connection going. Then from there I will normally try and do 2 or 3 designs, usually just colouring pencils on paper or done by hand. I don't tend to use much technology. Colouring pencils might be a bit of to and fro with the client, but adjusting, which one they prefer. Is there anything they want particularly highlighted or bits? So it gets kind of refined slightly and ends up with a finished scale drawing in colour. Once that's agreed, then it's all the making begins here in the studio. There are a few different techniques of making mosaics, but most of my work is what's called the paper face reverse technique. That entails drawing the design in mirror image on paper, full scale. So I'll get, if it's 50 foot long, I'll get a 50-foot piece of paper and draw the design in mirror image. These days I actually paint it as well, so there's a kind of chiaroscuro tonal painting done. And onto that, the mosaic's built by cutting the material, whether it's glass, ceramic, marble, cut and stuck down just with flour and water glue. So it would just make it here in the studio, cook up some flour and water. They're glued face down onto the paper. When the whole mosaic's finished, we get a scalpel and cut in between, in the gaps between the tiles, to break it down into sort of manageable sections. It's then crated up and shipped to the site, and then I'll go to the site, usually with a couple of assistants, put the cement down, drop the mosaic onto the wet cement with the paper facing up, and then the paper's damped. That releases the flour and water glue. Paper's peeled off and all the tesserae are left bedded in the cement. It's amazing what comes into that kind of fairly simple process of cutting tiles into bits and sticking them down. Suddenly, you're looking at getting licenses for driving cherry pickers and being aware of the structure of the building so that you're using the right kind of cements and the right kind of support for the mosaic and different building regulations and stuff like that. And I enjoy the technical stuff as well. Like I say, I like that end bit of putting on a hard hat and going mixing cement and fixing it to the place. It's getting that same attention to detail in fixing it as it got in making it. Some studios that don't fix their own work, they just hand it over to tilers to install. So there's quite a few different materials we use. Well, there's glass, which is a kind of very traditional mosaic material that probably most people are familiar with, but that separates into the sort of machine-made glass, vitreous, which is very regular. Most people are more familiar with sort of swimming pool tiles, that kind of thing. that's relatively inexpensive, and it's good for really huge jobs where the cost of the material can start to have quite a big impact on the cost of the job. Then there's the handmade glass, which is mostly made around Venice. Very traditional handmade glass enamel. You know, if you go to the furnaces where they make it, you can see the guys shoving the glass into the oven, mixing the pigments in, and it hasn't changed much since medieval times, apart from the fact that the furnaces are now electrical. It has an amazing colour palette, but it also has a kind of riven surface that makes it really unique. So this is the same material that you'll see if you go into St Mark's in Venice and look at the ceiling there. Then also I use a lot of unglazed porcelain. I really like porcelain because it's a really tough material. It's suitable for floors. It's got all those building requirements of slip resistance, frost resistance. It also cuts exactly, so you get a very tight kind of finish to it. It's very, very sort of precise in the way it cuts and fits together. And yeah, it's great for floors. It's the best material for floors, really. It doesn't have the massive colours that you get in glass, but the colours themselves are quite harmonious. And then, of course, the other big material is marble. That goes back to ancient times. It's nice to work with because you've got that feeling of you're kind of opening up the rock, something that's never been open for millions of years. You're kind of splitting it with a hammer, cutting it open. And that's the first time that bit of stone's been exposed for millennia. Obviously, it's a natural material. It's got natural colours. It has that kind of fluctuation of colour that's really nice to work with. It can also be challenging to work with because it's natural. Every colour's slightly different. It's not like the porcelain's always exactly the same. It doesn't matter what colour it is. But with marble, every different colour or every different stone has a different feel, a different way of cutting. Some are crumbly, some are really hard, some smell bad. Work with black marble, then the whole studio would start smelling of rotten eggs. I started out self-taught, I just read it in a book. However, since then, obviously, I've tried very hard to grab any opportunity to learn more. I've done various little courses here and there when the opportunity comes up. I also did quite a big course for a couple of weeks in Venice to familiarise myself with the handmade glass and how it's cut. And I'm always learning. It's like a never-ending thing because there's so much to learn. And I did a course just a few weeks ago with a mosaic maestro, Verdiano Marzi. It was really amazing. And then the other week I'm training to operate a cherry picker. Or the technology on the cement side is changing always. So I have to kind of go on courses to update my skills and knowledge of modern cement technology, which has changed actually a lot. The kind of method of cutting tiles and placing them, pretty much the same as the Romans, hasn't really changed at all. But the technology underneath the mosaic with the cements and stuff has changed massively just in the last 10, 20 years. You can learn the basics really on a weekend course. You can learn how to cut the material, basic how to place it and that kind of thing. There are some really good schools now where you can do courses maybe a week or a couple of days that are really good. If I was starting now, ideally you could apply to go to the school in Spilimbergo, which is like a 3-year. If you're not that committed or don't have that opportunity, there are short courses. There's a really good school in Ravenna. The school in Spilimbergo does short courses in the summer that are really good. Mosaic School in Chicago, where I teach, does really good courses all year round with really good visiting artists. There's also a London Mosaic School, actually, that does really good courses. So you can just start making, crack the tiles and stick them down. But there's a bunch of knowledge that you kind of need to know that you'll never learn just by trial and error. You need to be told, otherwise it doesn't just going to appear in your head. To get started is quite affordable and quite easy. You can do it on your kitchen table. And obviously, like all things, the more you get into it, a lifetime of learning it, the further you get into it, the more you can discover. But the good thing now, as opposed to when I started, there are places you can go and learn, and they are open. And when I first started, it was just that one book in the library, Italian firms who wouldn't tell you anything because it was trade secrets. But now it's much more open. There's lots of books. Definitely, I would say going on a course is much better. The kind of challenges you find in mosaics tend to be technical. I always find that every project I do, there's something different. You're having to learn something new. There's always new stuff you need to learn, and there can be technical challenges that pop up, especially if your technical knowledge is a bit lacking. I quite often get emails from people who will write to me saying, "Oh, why is my mosaic fallen off the wall?" That kind of thing. My main drive is to try and keep doing those kind of works that I like, that are engaged with community. And the kind of community I'm interested in is that where I engage with the community and I'm finding out what's important to them and expressing their stories, but I'm doing it in my artistic terms. Because there's another kind of community art where the artist just becomes a facilitator and the community do their own thing, and it always ends up a bit of a hodgepodge, like a ransom note. It doesn't really hold together, and I really feel that if you're an artist engaging in work like that, you should be there to transform it. It's not just a matter of the community doing what they want, because obviously they don't have the skills to make a nice mosaic particularly, or to design. You should be transforming and representing their vision maybe, rather than the limitations of their ability. Like, I've been making mosaics for, I think it's coming up for 35 years now. The world of mosaics has really opened up in the most amazing way. When I first started, I'd say that most mosaics were fairly conservative with a small c. They were quite in the Roman tradition. The course of my career, I've seen it real like blossom, so that now there are people making mosaics all around the world, and they're amazing. And the variety of ways of working and using mosaic art to express ideas is really incredible now, and there's some really amazing artists who work in mosaic. I'm really optimistic about where mosaic has the potential to go. I feel that it can do a lot more than it currently does, especially in the sort of public realm. I think we've only sort of scratched the surface of what's possible. I really get a lot of inspiration from other mosaic makers around the world and the kind of things that they're doing. Yeah. There's always been this kind of challenge for mosaic artists of breaking away from just being a craftsperson. One artist that I think is an artist, just happens to make mosaics, is Karen Amy. She's an American artist whose work, it's not just that she's making mosaics to her own design, but it's actually the reason she's making mosaics is, it feels like they have to be mosaics. It's not just about making a picture out of pieces. The fact that it's a mosaic is as much part of expressing what she's communicating as the design. So her work is really amazing. Marco Bravura in Italy, who does quite incredible mosaic sculptures. Douglas McInnes is an artist in Scotland who works with slate. He was a geologist, so he really knows about the material, and his work really expresses the kind of about geology. But there's a lot. Another really interesting thing about mosaic, actually, is that you're creative in the design is a creative aesthetic process. But then there's a whole nother layer of creativity that goes into the way it's made. You know, it's the way, the shapes that you're cutting, how the mosaic kind of flows, how you're mixing the colours, because obviously you can't mix colours like paint. You've got that kind of pixelated optical mixing of colour that really kind of brings the surface to life, and the texture of the mosaic, the way that light interacts with it. There's a whole nother level of creativity that you're doing every day when you're making it. So it just doesn't stop at the design. From the design to the mosaic, I feel there's a big change because there's a whole way you're expressing in the flow of the tile that's not in the design at all. The kind of movement that's in there and the colour mixing. But in terms of architectural mosaics, when you stand back from it, it looks exactly like the design. So it kind of is and isn't. Although if I'm working on my own design, sometimes I might cheat and move things about or change my mind. But generally, it'll look like the design that's presented to the client. Where the difference is when you walk up to it and you see the detail. None of that's in the design at all. That's all created. So kind of rich, the language of mosaic. There's a whole layers of other things going on within the mosaic. There's the gap between the mosaics can have a big impact. What colour that gap is, whether you're putting grout in there, plays a role in its colour, or whether it's just dark, it's not there. In the Vatican, funnily enough, they've been making mosaics for a while that are, the gaps between tiles are so tight and the colours are so close together that you can't tell it's a mosaic. It's only when you go really, really close you can actually see it's a mosaic. It just looks like a fresco painting. For me, that's kind of losing half of what mosaic's about. I like people to see that, there's a lump of colour has been pressed into that cement. So on the other extreme, you can get mosaics where you can really see squidge of blocks in the cement. It's really about that sort of physical. And in between those two extremes, there's all sorts of things going on with the flow. I mean, really, like classically, an ideal mosaic, your eye can flow through it without stopping. There's just kind of the courses of tiles kind of flow. I really like the way it's almost like brush strokes in a painting. You move the person's eye around with the way you lay the tiles. And then you've got the whole texture thing going on, so it's how it catches the light. In traditionally in the Byzantine era, when you used to do those huge gold domed ceilings, the tesserae would all be put in at different angles so that they all reflect the light at different angles. Because if you just mosaicked one of those gold domes flat, what you'd end up with would be like a ring of light, where it was just at that particular angle that catches the light and your eye. So by angling all the tesserae differently, it kind of makes it sort of sparkle and light up.